In this video, I'm going to show you 8 ways that you can reduce the muddiness of your track, or 8 reasons why it might just sound kind of dull. I start with the more obvious ones and work my way through less obvious ones that you might be missing, so make sure to watch till the end. Muddiness is a problem that can happen in the lows, the mids, or the high frequencies of your music. Essentially, muddiness just means a lack of clarity or too many overlapping sounds that really take away the definition of the sound, feels dull, less exciting, and it doesn't feel like it has room to breathe. So in this video, I will be tackling the whole spectrum in this track that I'm using. So let's go ahead and take a listen to the muddy track example that I have. So it's pretty muffled, it lacks clarity and definition. So let's go ahead and start going through different things that we can do to reduce muddiness in a mix. Fix number 1 is going to be properly filtering out unnecessary frequencies. So especially in the low end, you don't want frequencies overlapping too much. So we want to make sure we're using an EQ to clean up the low end and not have any of the major low end frequencies. Otherwise, it can sound muddy and cause other problems as well. So I have my bass split up into 3 layers. I have a sub frequency, I have my bass frequency, which is a higher octave of bass. And then I have the bass riff, which is the real character of the bass, giving it that movement and that rolling energy and that high end. But they all have low frequencies as well. So I have to shape the sounds with EQ so that they're not overlapping. So I go to my sub, I just have the single frequency, so it makes it very easy. I just want to make sure I'm cutting out this frequency from the other 2 layers. So I'm at 33 hertz. Let me go into my bass here. I am hitting 33 hertz here, so let me just throw on that cut using a high pass filter. I'm cutting out that lower frequency. So now I'm just in the 2nd octave of the bass. And last, I'll go into my bass riff and I'll make sure that I'm cutting off the first 2 octaves of bass. So I have my sub, then my bass layer, and then I have that high end above that 2nd bass layer so that it can add the character without adding too much low end or interfering with the low end. So I have the 1st octave of sub, my 2nd octave of bass, and I turn on the filter, and I've just gone just before this G here, which is still in key with my track. Even though it's not on the C, I want to leave it in because it gives it that nice feeling of warmth. And let's listen to all 3 before and after. Fix number 2 is making sure that your mix is actually balanced. So I know it's easier said than done to get a nice, healthy, balanced mix, but sometimes it's not actually that your track is muddy, it's just that it's lacking clarity or power by being unbalanced. If the low end is too loud compared to the high end, it'll sound muddy because you're not really getting that clarity from the high end, and if the high end is too sharp, you're not getting that power from the low end, and therefore your high end might just feel a little bit too ear-piercing or a little bit too full. And if your mids are too loud, then the low end and the high end is going to feel flat. So this can result in a muddy sounding mix, even though technically it's just unbalanced. I know it's easier said than done to get a balanced mix, but before you just claim that your track is muddy, try listening to a professional style track and compare to see how your high end and your low end compare to that track, and try to make a little bit of an adjustment to balance your mix prior to engaging in these other fixes, so you know you're not just overcompensating for something that's not actually muddy. I'm going to quickly go in and show an example by actually making some adjustments to make this mix feel more balanced. To me, that sounds less muddy because I can feel the high end a lot more. I can feel that lead a bit more. It feels like it's more dynamic, more expressive, and it doesn't feel so flat and dull. It's by no means perfect, but it is a step forward into sounding less muddy. Number 3 is going to be too many overlapping frequencies. Just like I used the filtering on the bass frequencies, talking about the mids and the highs, if we have too many overlapping frequencies, it can start to sound too muddy and we lose clarity. A perfect example of this is my lead frequencies here. It's getting overlapped with this pad that I have. So if we take a look at the frequencies of the lead, and I take a look at the frequencies of the pad, they're hitting in the same area. They're overlapping and it's causing them to both kind of lose their real shine in the mix because they're kind of just meshing together and it's just taking away that clarity of the lead. There are a couple of ways to address this. We can EQ certain frequencies out of each of the instruments so that they're not overlapping, making room for each other. But I'll show you an even easier way that I think is even more effective. And that's going to be just to make a change. Change the octave of the less important instrument, the one that you don't care so much if you have to change that sound. So I'll go into the pad and I'll just simply change the octave down to 1 lower. And let's take a listen now. Combining that with the first tip that we learned by filtering out some of that high end. And maybe finding a really prominent frequency here, maybe around 2.5K, and removing that from the pad as well. Combining these methods to create room for overlapping instruments is going to really help bring the clarity of the mix out. So if they're overlapping, try moving one up or down an octave. You can also try panning as well as filtering like we did with the bass in the first step. Number 4 is kick not balanced properly. If your kick has too much low end or mids or even highs, it can throw off the clarity of the mix. It can make it feel unbalanced and you can lose a lot of the definition by having too much of any of those frequency sections. To prove this, I'll use an EQ to cut out some of the frequencies in the kick, and you'll start to notice right away that it is lacking a little bit of definition and it starts to sound less clear and a little bit more muddy. So you'll notice that just bringing out those frequencies and making the kick feel a little bit less high quality and less balanced makes the whole track feel a little bit weaker. It makes the whole track feel less defined and in turn makes it feel a bit more muddy. Number 5, too much reverb and delay. As in pretty much everywhere that I stay while I'm traveling has too much reverb or delay to record properly. So that's why you get this very tiny bit of an echo in my voice that I do apologize for. Anyways, this is a common problem that I see all the time. Adding just way too much reverb to your instruments can really easily flood up the mix and make it sound super muddy. If I take this lead, for example, you can see that I'm dialing in below 50% dry wet. My decay time is only 2.76 seconds, and my feedback and dry wet on my delay aren't that much. Once I start pushing past 50% dry wet, I'm gonna lose more and more of the original dry signal, which is going to make it feel more and more washed out and not as clear. But you already knew that. The big issue here is neglecting things like the low cut, which cuts out some of the lower energy of the sound so that you're not adding that lower muddiness that comes with certain types of sounds using reverb. Also, your decay times are maybe too long, which causes a lot of overlap. Combining delay and reverb does sound really great, and maybe your feedback and your dry wet and your delay is long as well, but it can be overdone very easily. So next time you dial in your reverb and delay settings, maybe dial them in to where you think it's appropriate and then back off about 5 or 10%. The more instruments you're adding reverb to, maybe an extra pad, an extra string, an extra arp, every time you add another instrument, consider reducing the reverb or delay on the other instruments by just a little bit to give more room for the other reverbs that you're going to be bringing in. By the way, make sure to check the description below. There's links to free checklists, a free sample pack, links to my one-on-one video coaching, which you can book a session with me, as well as links to my production courses that you can take to learn music production at your own pace. Also a link to download this project that I'm using inside this video. Number 6 is going to be that your mix is too busy. Adding too many elements is going to cause a bit of an overlap in frequencies, as well as sometimes adding too many things can be distracting to the listener. You want to be adding in just enough that it feels full and interesting, but not too much that you're adding things that are distracting or causing just convolution and overlapping frequencies. I've added this extra loop to the track, and at first it might sound a little bit more interesting, but it actually does kind of muddy up the track. It kind of pulls away from the track by not really allowing it to breathe as much. Let's take a listen. The more you listen to it, the more dull it sounds, and it starts to just get in the way of the rest of the track. The idea is that you want to be bringing in enough instruments that it's sounding interesting and full, but you're not just bringing in extra instruments because you think that it doesn't really sound exciting. If you think the track is not exciting or that it's not sounding good, chances are it's not that you are not putting in too many elements, but the elements that you're working with aren't as good as they could be. So instead of just adding in more and more and more and making it feel more muddy and more distracting, and trust me, when you go to mix it, it's going to be more of a pain. Try dialing back what you have and figuring out what's really working, what's really adding value to the track. And if you can make what you have already sound catchier, groovier, and better before introducing more elements. Oversaturating your bass. A problem I deal with a lot of the time in my music, and a problem I see in a lot of producers' music, is their bass is actually too saturated. We use saturation on our basses to make it feel more full and more exciting and more present, but if we add too much, or if we don't address the low frequencies that are in the bass that are actually too loud, then we get this muddiness that is actually a very fine line between adding weight and adding muddiness. So let's go ahead and take a look. So if I solo my bass here, we can take a look at the EQ, and I can see the low octave of C is 66, and I have another octave of bass here, but in between I have this G. And that is just a harmonic of the sawtooth that I'm using in the actual waveform. So by boosting this up, we'll start to hear that it gets really muddy. We lose a bit of definition of the bass, and it starts to feel really warm, but actually too full. So by slightly reducing this, I can actually get a little bit more clarity out of the bass. If I go too far, it starts to feel a bit thin. Let's try this on the entire bass channel as well. It's very obvious when I'm pushing up this frequency in the entire bass. So if I reduce that slightly, it's pretty subtle, but in the grand scheme of things, it is actually adding quite a bit of clarity to that bass. I run into this issue a lot of the time because I tend to use sawtooth style bass lines a lot. So if you're someone who uses saturated bass lines like I do, this is probably something you'll run into a lot. The last technique I have for you is what I call the magic scoop. This is a wide band frequency scoop that you can pass across your whole master channel until you find a problem area, and then alleviate that by reducing the volume in the actual instruments that are causing the problems. So on my master channel, I can just grab an EQ and just grab this note here and slightly move it back and forth until I find an area that sounds better with the gain being reduced. So to me, it actually sounds cleaner and less muddy if I reduce this area right here by a few decibels. This is pretty common because there is usually a lot of buildup in this area here. Instead of doing this on the entire master, I want to just find the actual instruments that are causing this buildup and reduce them individually. So we're making sure we're grabbing the problem from the source and not just fixing it on the master chain. We'll go back into my bass instrument because I believe that's where the problem is. And to me, that sounds cleaner. And we always want to make sure we're referencing in solo as well as in our mix. You don't want to make any final decisions to mix adjustments without hearing it in the context of the entire mix. So to me, it just sounds a tiny bit cleaner, and that's all I'm really trying to do in the final stages of a mix sound. Just get those problem areas and reduce them slightly to make the track less muddy. If you want to learn more about mixing, check out one of the 2 videos right here. And if you want to download the project file, make sure to click the link in the description below.